I'm Joy Mayer. I'm the director of Trusting News, and this is the last in our series of quick webinars that we are doing in conjunction with the rollout of trust kits that we have created to collect in one place some of our most basic tips for earning trust. So we are recording these to share later, and I do have a reporter who's I've presented with before who's going to join us after I share some tips to share her experience earning trust with wary sources. So we'll save plenty of time for questions. The presentation part will not go more than half an hour, so feel free to log off then if you need to. If you want to stay for an optional 15 minutes or so of conversation and Q&A, you're absolutely welcome to. So feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, and my colleague Molly will be sharing links there as well. So at Trusting News, we decide, we learn as much as we can how people decide what news to trust, and then turn what we learn into strategies for journalists to earn trust. Today, we're going to talk specifically about earning trust with sources and how much more complicated that has gotten, and things journalists can do to both have better empathy for what it's like to be a news source and also to be more effective as we approach people about being sources. There's a lot that journalists can learn from people who are skeptical or wary of talking to them about what the public more generally thinks about their work. There's a lot that we can learn through conversations with people about their hesitancies, about what people assume about how journalists operate, about our integrity, about our humanity, and about what rights they have as sources and what the interactions will be like. We do think very differently about this, appropriately, I think, when we're thinking about public officials or people who are in power or people who are have as part of their work or their responsibilities some accountability to the public. They need to be approached differently, and they have a different set of rights and a different kind of relationship to journalists than regular people we are approaching to invite them to share their lives and their views with us. It is reasonable for people in either bucket, actually, to be nervous talking to journalists, to be suspicious of journalists' motives or of the process, to be impatient with how long it takes for stories to publish or with kind of the timetable of journalism. It's reasonable for people to be guarded and to wonder what will happen, to feel sort of vulnerable as they think about what will happen if they open up to journalism. If people are used to being sources, it is, of course, we can approach them with a clearer sense of expectations of the right of the public to hear from them. But I think too often journalists approach regular people with that same sort of demand, the same sort of approach as if we are owed people's stories. And I want to talk today about some approaches that can work in either bucket. We are seeing more often public officials who are wary of talking to journalists because they don't think they need to, or because they don't feel that journalists will accurately represent their views. But then we also see a lot of hesitancy on the part of regular people who are just not sure if it's worthwhile or safe for them to open up to journalists. So I think we can have empathy for people if they are coming at it from a place of real anger or hostility. If they bring a set of misassumptions about how journalism operates and are lumping us in there. And also if they have experiences themselves or in their community being misrepresented or harmed by journalism. The more we understand about how they are feeling coming into the interaction, the more equipped we can be to smooth the way for successful interviews. We have to remember that any experience or assumptions they have are probably true for somebody in the media landscape. We can find examples of where journalists have done harm, have misrepresented communities, have been irresponsible with stories, have not been cautious to present a diversity of views in their best light. And it feels unfair to journalists if they are held accountable for things done by other news organizations or other things that fall under the very large umbrella of journalism or media, but it is reasonable for people to carry those assumptions with them, and it's up to us to differentiate what we do. So today, we are going to talk about a few basic principles of audience perceptions of news and how to earn trust. We're going to talk about reasons people have for being apprehensive or suspicious of journalists. We're going to talk about strategies for interactions with sources. And then we're going to hear some tips from a reporter, Bobbi, who was on another panel with me recently and has really great things to share about her experiences working with vulnerable populations. So a few basic principles to start with. The first is that we can't persuade everyone to trust us. That's not reasonable. So if we focus all of our efforts on people who have decided that we are corrupt or dishonest and nothing we do is going to change their minds, that's not practical. So do feel free to set them aside. The second tip is that being a news consumer is really confusing and overwhelming. And a lot of people feel overwhelmed trying to find information, have a very casual relationship with the news and with news brands, and therefore are not oriented the way we are to really see the difference between this type of newsroom, this type of journalist, this type of publication platform, this type of story. They just aren't really plugged into that. And aren't paying that much attention. And the more we understand about that, the easier it can be for us to drop our defenses a little bit and take time to help explain where we fit into that landscape and why we personally are worthy of trust. Third principle is that there are problems on both sides of this broken relationship with our audience. We could make a very long list of things we want the public to do differently as they consume journalism and interact with journalists. But fundamentally, this is an existential problem for us. It's our ability to be a public service, and it's our credibility, and it's our business that are on the line when this relationship is fractured. So it's up to us to really address this. Fourth basic principle is what I mentioned a minute ago, that there are plenty of things done in the name of journalism that are not that we would not stand behind or support. And it is rational for people to be skeptical of kind of what they see in the media. It's actually wise for them to not have automatic trust of things. And so our lane is not to defend journalism, it's to differentiate our own work and show what makes it trustworthy. And then the last initial principle here is that we don't get credit for any decisions, ethics, or values that are invisible to the audience. Anything we do that is thoughtful, that where we are trying to protect someone's privacy or safety, when we are taking care with the words that we use or the story framing or the sourcing, none of that is visible and we do not get automatic credit for it. So we need to really work on finding ways to be more transparent about that. And we're not going to talk too much about transparency today, but we do have a lot of resources for those. So two quick bits of research I'm going to share with you. The first is that whether people feel like journalists are worthy of trust is really important, and feelings are squishy and kind of hard to pin down. It's easier to make a list of the facts of what makes journalism trustworthy, but the fundamental question of whether people have a sense that we are on the side of good, that we are behaving really in an altruistic public service, whether we are honest, whether we have integrity, those are things that journalists should spend more time concerning themselves with. We know that most people have never talked to a journalist. The last time Pew asked this question, only 79% of people said that they ever spoken with or been interviewed by a journalist. So when we approach people to invite them to be sources, it might be the first time they've ever talked. First, it could be the only time that they ever even speak to a journalist. So, and that number goes down. People are less likely to have ever spoken to a journalist if they are not white, old, college educated, and in a high socioeconomic bracket. So depending on who you're approaching, it's really important to remember that they don't have a frame of reference and they don't have sort of an automatic sense of your trustworthiness. When Knight and Gallup asked in research this year whether people agree with the statement, in general, most local news organizations do not intend to mislead, misinform, or persuade the public, 44% of people said, yes, I agree, they do not intend to do those things. But a bigger bucket of people was either not sure or disagreed with that statement. To dig a little bit deeper into that, they looked at the dimensions of what they call emotional trust in the news. And I want you to look at the words bracketed in green here: benevolence and integrity. These address the basic question of whether news organizations, they ask this both for local and for national, whether news organizations care how their reporting positively or negatively affects society, and also whether it is in the best interest of the public. And the numbers are not looking good across dimensions for these questions. And then integrity is, do you believe that people do not intend to mislead, misinform or persuade the public? So in terms of what we are here to do and the way that we go about doing it, if you are approaching people knowing that their set of experiences so far and their frame of reference for you involves negative answers to these questions, can help you take the time to go about your business differently and to realize that you are stepping into a situation in which you do not have automatic trust. So what we believe at Trusting News is that earning the trust is the job of every journalist. And today we're going to really focus on, as reporters are out seeking interviews and trying to invite people to connect with them and to be sources, what does it look like to actively earn trust rather than expect it? And it involves earning the right to tell people stories and defend your integrity, along with understanding what your audience thinks of you and being ready to explain your work. So a fundamental question that we at Trusting News ask newsrooms is, who would feel seen and understood by your journalism, and who might feel neglected or misrepresented? There are a lot of different reasons that people would answer this question in different ways, based on all the traditional fault lines: age, race, class, gender, political lines. There are a lot of things that people would point to that influence whether they see their own lives and values and experiences reflected in journalism, or whether they feel like journalism doesn't see them, ignores them, or actually misrepresents their views. So as one example, one of the classes that we run at Trusting News is on earning trust with communities of color. And I want to just share with you some of the things that our partner journalists in one of those classes heard when they went out to interview people in their community about how well journalists do at telling their stories. A few of their answers. These community members said they often don't know any journalists and don't see journalists as a presence in their community. They're very aware of how often their communities are presented in a negative light or covered only when there are problems. I'm sure these don't come as a surprise. They definitely see people flattening out their identities. We heard from several people that their communities are complex, and also that individual people can identify in really in complex ways, and that journalists way too often try to assign a label to a group of people or even to one person without allowing room for nuance and complexity there. Journalists definitely also lump people together in a way that gives the impression in our coverage that there's monolithic groups of people are going to vote or behave or think the same way. A couple other points. Journalists see themselves as keeping an eye on power, but to a lot of people in our communities, we are part of the powerful structure. We are aligned with the elite, often with white institutions. Rather than serving as a check on the elite, we are seen as being aligned with them. And we see ourselves as watchdogs, but people have a very different sense of what that even means. People see us as getting in the way of public officials' ability to do our jobs, not necessarily as a productive part of the system. They also see us as, watchdogs on people we would like to be watchdogs on, but not necessarily using that power that we have in ways that the community would choose. So we actually hear these common themes across quite a few buckets of people who report having low trust in news, or who feel like they are not seen and understood by journalism. We hear it from BIPOC communities. We hear it from immigrant communities. We hear it from people who lean right politically. Obviously, that's a big area in which a big part of the country, if you divide along political lines, does not trust that journalists have integrity and benevolence. We are also hearing it from rural communities and low-income communities that they feel like along geographic and socioeconomic lines, journalists just don't do a good job reflecting the nuance and complexity of life along those lines. And we know that journalists are less likely to have an active faith community and habit and attend worship service regularly than the population overall. And we hear from people of faith as well that they think journalists don't understand the lens through which they see the world and don't cover that lens accurately. So one way that we like to think about this at Trusting News is, how well do journalists do at staffing newsrooms in a way that would connect with these people who feel not well covered by the news? When you look at low-income communities, rural communities, people who lean right, BIPOC communities, immigrant communities, are they reflected on your staff? And one of the ways we know that journalists are whiter, more educated, and more likely to live in liberal places than the public overall. 22% of newsroom employees live in New York, DC, or LA, which means journalists live in big blue bubbles, and we are surrounded by people who see the world quite similarly in that case. when you look more deeply at the things that we cover and what people's experiences are with the criminal justice system, the prison system, with disability services, with the medical system, with gun culture, what experiences are shared with the people you aim to serve, and where are there gaps on your staff? And as we think about approaching people as sources who fall into some of those buckets, it's worth thinking about who on your staff can help you understand them, and where you have some work to do to approach with real curiosity what life is like for the people you want to interview. We know that our assumptions, values, and experiences as human beings inform our journalism, and it makes sense that the public notices where we are doing a good job reflecting their life and where they're not. And remember that they are carrying with them their sense of how the media covers them. They are not parsing in their interactions with you necessarily that your newsroom has done them wrong or has done a poor job telling stories about their community. They are feeling mistreated by or ignored by or misrepresented by journalism in general. So recognizing that the same way that I might have a general sense of how cable companies operate, or how medical clinics operate, or how churches operate, or things that I'm not as intimately familiar with, they have a sense of how journalism operates, and every interaction we have with them is an opportunity for us to tell them how we operate, not necessarily defend journalism overall. So one tip I'll give is that it's important to consider how your coverage would feel to people who see the world differently. And one of the ways we do that at Trusting News is to teach newsrooms to watch for signals of credibility or fairness, and to put their coverage through sort of a test of seeing what, if people saw this issue through different lenses, how would it feel? So I'll just share quickly before we move on to strategies for sourcing. I'll share quickly that we have a resource that is a checklist you can use with your coverage to examine the sourcing, the language used, the framing of the stories, and ask yourself questions of how that story would land with people who come at an issue in different ways. One other resource I'll share is that we have done a lot of projects with journalists where we send them out into communities to examine, to learn from them about how their lives are reflected in the news. And we have some strategies. We have video interviews with journalists and some strategies they have learned about how best to use time with people with low trust in news to learn about how journalists can learn and act on what they hear from those conversations. Okay, so strategies for interacting with sources. I'm going to share some, and then I'm going to ask Bobbi to share some as well. So recognizing that you're part of the media, and that the people who staff the media overall do not reflect the country. You can only control what you can control. And so to enter interactions with that empathy in mind. Be ready for questions about how you operate. It's amazing to me how little people know about things like how we decide what to cover, how we decide who to interview. Does everyone you interview make it into the story? Why do people have to give their full names? Some basic questions that journalists take for granted are actually things that we don't articulate, and that it would be very smart of us to do a better job making time in our interactions to answer these questions, and also to have spots on our website that answer these basic questions of what does it mean? What can you expect if you talk to a journalist? And save time to answer those questions, and also to explain the story you're working on, your approach to your work in general as a journalist, and this process of telling of reporting this story. So let me tell you what I mean by each of those things. When you explain your story to a potential source, they have no idea what you're trying to accomplish. And very often journalists start in the middle of the story. They just jump right in with the questions. I've had this, I get interviewed quite a bit, and I've had this happen to me so many times where people are like, I have a question. I'm like, hang on just a second. Can you back up for a minute and tell me how I fit into this story? What is the question you're trying to answer with this story? And what is it you're hoping I'll address? Can you my answers will be better if you can show me how I fit into the bigger picture of what you're trying to do. So taking time to say, let me tell you about the story, why I'm doing it, why I think it's important, the general range of people I'm talking to, and what I hope you can share. Explain your approach to journalism if you can. As a reporter, I am committed to being careful to do this thing or not to do this thing. here's some other reporting I've done that you can take a look if you want to see that I have a careful approach that I take to my journalism. I do work hard to be nuanced, or to allow room for complexity, or to give people room to respond. I hope this feels accurate and fair. And here's how I will work to be accurate and fair with this story. Here are examples. And then also the process. We often don't take enough time to say, am I going to come to your house? How much time am I asking for? Are we going to record audio or video? Where might the story go? What kind of reaction might the story bring? And are you prepared for that? Do you know that your name is going to be in our social media posts and in our newsletter and on our broadcast? And making sure people are ready for the attention that might bring. And then also what happens next, a lot of times reporters hang up and don't clue people in at all to, this is actually a day turn. It's going to be up later today. I won't have time to circle back with you. Or this story might not publish for a month and it has several layers of editing. When can they expect to hear from you again? One quick piece that I love so much is Audie Cornish, who used to be at NPR, wrote in an interview with CJR that she has sort of a Miranda rights routine she goes through, saying, you and I are going to talk for this amount of time, but it's going to be edited down to a third or a fourth of that. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers comfortably short, but if you feel like you want to restate something, feel free. Just really helping people feel comfortable with what's going to happen and helping them understand what they have control over and how they can influence how it's going to go. Let me close with this. One question that I really love journalists to ask, and I wonder how it would change your interviews if you asked before each interview, what are you afraid I might get wrong in this story? So that you can ground yourself in whatever fears or anxiety people have coming into it, in whatever misperceptions or mischaracterizations the sources feel journalists have fallen back on in previous coverage. How might you approach your questions differently if you had that sort of caveat in mind? So a couple quick things about Trusting News before I bring Bobbi up. We have a weekly newsletter called Trust Tips that is one quick actionable tip for earning trust. We'd love to have you subscribe. That's also where we announce future trainings and resources. Today's webinar is based on a trust kit specifically on earning trust with sources, and it has more step-by-step guides and some other examples of how reporters have approached this. And then the work on how who we are as human beings shows up in our journalism is something we call Dimensions of Difference. It's a partnership with Spaceship Media, and we have an online guide for newsrooms that could use help talking that through that you can find at trustingnews.org/dimensions.